Our next topic in our discussion of philosophically informed psychotherapy and its application to narcissism in particular and to cluster B personality disorders is whether narcissism challenges responsibility, namely whether the ascription of narcissism to a person entails assuming that that person is less responsible for their actions. There are two types of responsibility that need to be discussed here. The first is criminal responsibility for crimes, for criminal offenses. It is often called culpability in legal vocabulary. This is the first type. And the second type of responsibility is moral responsibility, which is broader and more demanding. Now, with regard to criminal responsibility, the narcissist organization of personality presents a disturbance of the socially desirable, normal functioning of libido, which projects outside the person towards other people and generates a genuine interpersonal attachment in healthy people, which is the foundation of various types of social, including emotional bonds between healthy individuals. However, the particular narcissistic type of disturbance of what would be considered a normal structure of interpersonal dynamics does not satisfy the traditional conditions for reduced criminal responsibility. Thus, individuals who are either diagnosed or described as narcissists within the criminal proceedings are typically not excused from criminal culpability and punishment because they satisfy both the cognitive criterion of criminal responsibility, namely that they have known that what they were doing was illegal, and the volitional criterion that they could have acted otherwise. These two types of criteria, which have since been built into the criminal codes across the Western world, originated in the 19th century England in the 1843 murder trial of one Daniel Macnaghten, who for the first time was found to have been, I quote, so deranged that he did not know what he was doing and was not able to help it, end of quote, and was therefore acquitted. The Macnaghten rules stipulate that the perpetrator of a crime must be aware of the nature of their actions from a legal point of view and must have the basic capacity to decide to commit the crime or to refrain from committing it. If the perpetrator fails either of the two psychological tests, this is automatically grounds for granting them reduced responsibility or for acquitting them altogether. There has been a long and agonizing debate in forensic psychiatry and in the philosophy of punishment as to whether persons with personality disorders, or psychopaths as they were once called, including the narcissists, ought to be held fully accountable for their actions, given that their internal dynamics are obviously different from that of healthy individuals and that they must find it more difficult to choose to treat others as individuals deserving of dignity and rights. The prevailing view has been that narcissists, like psychopaths, are fully aware of the status of their actions from the society's point of view, and that they are able to choose their actions despite their internal inclination to manipulate, coerce, co-opt, and ultimately exploit others and social arrangements for their own benefit. The latter is deductible from the very dynamics of narcissistic abuse, where the narcissist is able to display the so-called love-bombing behavior, which is generally socially desirable in the baiting phase of attracting their social prey, before moving on to devaluation and ultimately to a narcissistic discard of the person. When this dynamic is generalized, it becomes clear that narcissists do not succumb to a compulsion to make decisions that are wrong in various ways, but that they deliberately choose to do so in order to strategically obtain a supply of narcissistic validation. Their narcissistic personality organization provides them with a motive to commit the criminal wrongdoing, in cases obviously when their wrongdoings are criminal, but not with an excuse for doing so. So they are considered fully criminally responsible. With regard to moral and value responsibility, The issue of moral responsibility of narcissists, and by extension of psychopaths as well, might be considered more nuanced than that of culpability. Without going through the entire history of the ethics of responsibility, which is an impossible task in one place, of course, I focus here on a modern account of moral responsibility that focuses values and which, in my opinion, summarizes much of what we have come to know through the history of ethics about what individual responsibility practically comes down to. In his 2007 paper on the concept of responsibility, Philip Pettit starts from the obvious premise that, I quote, holding responsible has an implication that if what was done is something bad, then the agent is a candidate for blame. If what was done is something good, then the agent is a candidate for approval and praise. According to Pettit, in order to qualify, I quote, for fitness to be responsible, as he says, in the mentioned sense, one must satisfy 3 key criteria, all of which are based on values and the ability to understand, choose, and accept certain values. They include, first, value relevance, namely a situation where an autonomous moral agent faces a relevant value choice. Second, value judgment, where the agent has the capacity to understand the meaning and status of their choices and has access to information necessary to ascertain the value significance of each choice. And third, value sensitivity, namely the fact that the agent is able to exercise control of their choices based on the appraisal of their relative value. The criteria 2 and 3, value judgment and value sensitivity, obviously crudely correspond to the McNaughton rules, the agent's ability to understand the significance of their actions and ability to become informed about the nature of the choice they are about to make corresponds to the cognitive part of the McNaughton rules, whereas one's ability to maintain control of their actions translates into the volitional part of McNaughton rules. The narcissist satisfies these 2 criteria, so we are essentially left with Pettit's criterion 1, which is value relevance, in order to see if, unlike with culpability, the narcissist might escape at least a degree of ordinary moral responsibility that agents face for their choices. Value relevance, according to Pettit, involves a moral drama, where the person must be able to understand the moral tension produced by a particular dilemma or decision-making situation. In other words, it is largely a matter of moral sensibility, which a person must have developed in themselves in order to be able to even perceive and adequately appraise the moral relevance of a particular decision one is to make. This can be easily illustrated by pointing to an ordinary discrimination we all make between morally challenging choices as opposed to those we consider morally uncontroversial. Choosing the color of a cigarette lighter is a morally non-challenging choice, while choosing whether to give money to a beggar or not is a morally relevant choice. Picking a destination for holidays is morally irrelevant, however, deciding whether to reward a poor but underperforming student with a higher grade necessary for his enrolling into the next year of university is morally significant. In many cases, we do not appear to have any difficulty discriminating between the routine choices we make that are not morally challenging and those that require moral deliberation. However, in not so few cases, things get more complicated as the borderline between morally relevant and morally indifferent becomes blurred. It may seem that choosing a set of shoes is morally irrelevant. However, for an informed modern citizen, it is not irrelevant whether the shoes were produced in a country where child labor in shoe factories is a norm, or where the production process causes major environmental pollution to the detriment of the very existence of organic communities. To make this choice, one needs considerably more information than the size, look, and price of the shoes. An informed, responsible decision might require days of research into the producer of the shoes, the location of the factory, and its reputation. Thus, what until very recently appeared as an obviously morally irrelevant decision may now be one laden with moral and social controversy. Consider the use of language. We're conveying information about the death of a close one to their relatives, or informing the patient about the diagnosis of an incurable illness, while falling within one's normal perimeter of truthful, and thus, on some level at least, also moral action, may be subject to a range of ethical nuances. Depending on the amount of the information revealed and the manner of the use of language, the news might inflict significantly difficult amounts of stress and pain on the recipient. Clearly, legally speaking, a military officer informing the family of a soldier's death, or a doctor telling the person that they have cancer, are entitled to be direct and fully truthful. Should they convey the information in the most insensitive and painful way, as long as it is the truth, they cannot be held legally responsible. However, the moral dimension of the same act is more demanding. By the manner of conveying the news, one reflects one's moral sensibility, one's ability to empathize with those stricken by the loss of a relative or of their own health. One can act in praiseworthy or blameworthy way in this situation, depending on the way one uses language. One's ability to convey the information in a morally sensitive way will depend on one's moral emotions, and they will have been developed as a result of one's moral self-care and moral education. In more nuanced cases, such as the above one, the narcissists tend to fare very badly, for all of the reasons described as constituting the very narcissistic pathology. They are focused on themselves, have no authentic emotions for others, they are almost incapable of feeling any empathy, and their attention is attached firmly on the outcomes of the relationships with others for themselves, without taking into account the desires, interests, and experiences of others in their impact on others' lives independently of the narcissist. Thus, the narcissist will most likely be genuinely disinterested in the environmental impact of their choices, unless it is some kind of major and immediate impact which affects the narcissist themselves, or in the way one's language offends or hurts others, if the narcissist does not in some way depend on the relevant others or expect something from them. The narcissists are notorious for not taking care of the way they use words, and for being insensitive and hurtful in their communication with those they consider less powerful or influential than the narcissists themselves. Thus, the narcissist will tend to fail the first value test proposed by Pettit, namely being able to recognize the moral relevance of many decision-making situations. After all, this is the most obvious and common complaint levied against narcissists in everyday life, namely that they are insensitive to the needs and feelings of others when they do not impact the narcissist's own interests and well-being. This would appear to suggest that the narcissist qualifies for a reduced moral responsibility for value-laden decisions. My argument to the contrary, however, is based on the nature of the moral sensibility in the context of moral duty of self-care and self-change, and this will be the topic of the next video.